Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chapter 1, A New World. The subtopics, the things we will be focusing on in this chapter and in this lecture, we look at the first Americans, Indian freedom, the expansion of Europe, contact with Europeans, the Spanish Empire, and the French and Dutch empires. If you want to look in your textbook on page 5, you'll see a list of these subtopics with some more specifics as far as more detail of what we'll be talking about in each section. And also what we want to talk about as we get started are the focus questions. As we go through each portion of this lecture, you want to keep in mind how the information that you see and hear relates to the larger thematic question. So for this first section, we're talking about what were the major patterns of Native American life in North America before Europeans arrived. So my suggestion is that as you go through the lecture and as you are taking notes in your note packet, write small phrases from what you see, or if you want to add to from what you're reading in your book, anything that's going to connect the information back to this focus question, or examples that would help answer this focus question. So you really want to be thinking about in this first section, what's Native American life like in North America before the Europeans arrived? Right? What we're looking at right now is a picture that is an engraving done by John White, and he was an English artist who spent a year on the Outer Banks of North Carolina from 1585 to 1586. He was part of an expedition that was sponsored by Sir Walter Raleigh. You can see in the picture we've got a central street that connects that is surrounded by fields of corn. The central street really connects the houses. In the lower part, you can see Native Americans dancing and taking part in a religious ceremony. All right, the first Americans to settle what eventually became the United States were very culturally diverse. They migrated by land over the Bering Strait or by sea. Some scientists will date it as far back as 60,000 years ago, up to 15,000 years ago. Some of these native peoples even reaching the southern tip of South America, perhaps even 11,000 years ago. They were facing a warming climate and hunting animals such as the woolly mammoth and great bison into extinction. These first settlers later developed agriculture, including cultivation of corn, squash, beans, that then enabled these larger civilizations to emerge. The Indian societies of the first Americas that were encountered by Europeans included civilizations with populations of several millions of people. These societies had large cities, road and irrigation systems, trade networks, and impressive architectural achievements. However, even the most developed Indian civilizations, even those located especially in South America, lacked the technologies like metal tools, machines, gunpowder, scientific knowledge that were needed for long distance navigation. And those are the tools which allowed Europeans to conquer them and then to turn around and justify that conquest. In North America, about 3,500 years ago, we want to focus on one native culture, specifically the mound builders, that had centered their community in the lower Mississippi River Valley around a series of semicircular mounds and established extensive trade networks throughout North America. For about 3,000 years in what is now northeastern Arizona, the Hopi and the Zuni and their ancestors lived in settled villages with irrigation and canal systems, and they engaged in long-distance trade as well, and becoming, after a period of decline, what the Spanish called the Pueblo Indians. The Pacific coast was also densely populated by hundreds of independent groups of natives who lived primarily by fishing and gathering food. And on the Great Plains, which is Iowa, where we are, many Indians hunted the buffalo herds, while others lived in agricultural villages. In eastern North America, hundreds of tribes from the Choctaw and Cherokee to the Chickasaw in the southeast to the Iroquois of the northeast lived by hunting, fishing, gathering, and through agriculture. And they engaged with one another in trade, diplomacy, and occasionally went to war with one another. When Europeans arrived, Native peoples were tremendously diverse and differentiated by language, custom, political system, and even religious beliefs. And they did not consider themselves a single unified people. They really felt different. They did not have a common cultural or racial ethnicity. You can see on the map 1.1, this illustrates to us probable routes by which the first Americans settled in the Western Hemisphere at various times. You can see, this back to, some scientists believe as many as 60,000 years ago, how some of these groups came across the Bering Straits and settled into the North American hemisphere. Here we see a map of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, and the Gulf of Mexico. This is probably produced by a Spanish conquistador and published in about 1524, an edition of the Letters of Hernan Cortez. The map shows the city's really complex system of canals, bridges, and dams, and the Great Temple is in the center. You can also see gardens and a zoo visible on the map as well. This is a modern aerial photograph of the ruins of Pueblo Bonita. This is in present-day New Mexico. You can see the rectangular structures are the foundations of dwellings, and the circular ones are kivas, or these are places of religious worship. The next picture here are the cliff dwellings in Arizona. These cliff dwellings were believed to have been created anywhere between 300 and 1300, but this photograph was taken in 1873. And this next map that I want to take a look at, and I want you to look at for a little while, really shows what the native populations of North America were like at the time of first contact with Europeans. Numerous tribes, their own languages, religious beliefs, economic and social structures, and it suggests, if you look at the key, the numerous ways of life existing at the time. Okay, so we want to take a little bit of a look at Native American religion, specifically in the sense that this did give some common characteristics as far as religion goes for the North American Indian societies. Religious practices were often directly related to farming and hunting, and they invested living things like plants, animals, and non-living things like the water and wind with spiritual power. So plants, animals, water, and wind were given a spiritual identity, given spiritual significance, and this defined membership in their communities. Each Indian society respected and gave authority to those who seemed to have a spiritual or supernatural powers, while most of their religions, like those of Europe, held that a single creator was at the top of the spiritual order. They did not distinguish sharply between natural and supernatural, so there wasn't a big difference between secular and religious life. Unlike Europeans, North American societies did not treat land as a commodity to be owned privately by individuals, but instead had family and communal-based notions of property. So land was not something that Native Americans, for the most part, thought of as property or to be owned. Land was to be shared with the family, to be shared with the community. Indian tribes and groups did have systems of social status. However, they did not devote themselves to accumulating wealth and material goods. Trading was as much social and cultural practice that emphasized generosity and gift-giving as it was an economic exchange. Relationships between men and women were also very different than those of Europeans. Most, not all, but most North American Indian societies were matrilineal, and this means that land property was passed through the mother's side of the family instead of the father. It was possible for women to own property, to divorce their husbands, to take part in religious ceremonies, to help select male tribal leaders. Men did assume political leadership and provided their masculinity and proved it, by engaging in hunting, agriculture, and warfare. We see on this map, this is a Catawba map that illustrates the differences between Indian and European conceptions of landed property. The map shows not possession of a specific territory, but trade and diplomatic connections between various Native American groups. The colony of Virginia is represented by the rectangle on the lower right-hand corner. So again, they're not showing ownership really so much as it is how trade and diplomacy and how the different groups are connected with one another. Again, we see another drawing by John White. Remember, John White is the artist of the illustration at the beginning of our lecture. This is one from 1585. Shows the canoe filled with fish, while two men harpoon others in the background. Among the wildlife illustrated are hammerhead sharks. Catfish really shows us the Europeans' view of Native American life. Europeans first tended to see the Indians as either as these noble savages or uncivilized, brutal, inferior barbarians. So regardless of if they respected them and saw them somewhat as equals, that would be the noble savages, or as inferior, they saw them as barbaric and uncivilized. Okay? Over time, negative images of the Indians came to dominate the Europeans' views of indigenous peoples, with Europeans focusing on the natives' apparent lack of religion, land use practices, and the way that genders were related to one another as the basis of their inferiority. So they saw all of those things as the reasons why Native Americans would be inferior to the Europeans. Indians were seen as devilish heathens, people who didn't use the land properly, which in the eyes of the English and the French and the Dutch justified their exploration and taking of the land from the Native Americans because they weren't using it appropriately, so it was okay that they would just take it. And as people who subverted European gender roles by allowing weak men to engage in leisure activities like hunting and fishing and leaving the agricultural work to Native women who many Europeans believed belonged in the home. You can see in this photograph, or this engraving, by a French Jesuit priest to talk a little bit more about how Europeans viewed Indian religion. You see in the picture that there's a demon hovering over the Iroquois longhouse, really suggesting that the Indians worshipped the devil. Here we can see in this picture here that Indian women are planting crops, men are breaking the sod. This is an engraving by Theodore de Bry, and it's based on a painting by Jacques Moyne de Morgue. Morgue was part of an expedition of French Huguenots to Florida in 1564, and he escaped when the Spanish destroyed the outpost in the following year. In this next section, we are going to be looking at how Indian and European ideas of freedom differed just before, so right as there was contact between the Europeans and Native Americans. So what did they think about this topic of freedom? Now, some Europeans saw Native Americans as embodying freedom and liberty as Europeans understood the term. But most soon thought that such notions of freedom were foreign to Native societies. Europeans believed the Indians were savages in part because they did not seem to have government or legal systems. So to them, that was lacking the respect for authority and discipline and order that Europeans believed marked their own civilization. The modern idea of freedom as personal independence, which often was based on the ownership of private property, meant little to most Indian societies. Indians, however, had their own ideas of freedom, which was evident in the practice of their small-scale slavery in some Indian groups. Although buying and selling slaves was unknown, and in their resistance to enslavement by Europeans. Although Indians respected individual thought and judgment that conflicted with group decisions, generally they emphasized commitment to family and community. Group autonomy and self-determination were important, and mutual obligations which would accompany the ideas of belonging and connectedness were more important and valued more than individual freedom. When Europeans colonized the New World, they had multiple ideas of freedom, really focusing more on the collection of rights and privileges, which in European society were reserved for a small portion of the population. One important idea of freedom for Europeans was religious or moral, and based on an individual's decision to subordinate himself to the Christian God. This was not the same as modern notions of religious freedom or tolerance. Each European country had an established church, and their governments often suppressed or heavily regulated other Christian and non-Christian groups. Secular ideas of freedom located liberty in the individual obedience to law and acceptance of one's rank and its duties within a rigid and extensive social hierarchy. This ranged from urban poor and rural peasants at the bottom to church officials, hereditary aristocrats and nobles, so those of you people with titles, and kings and other members of monarchies are at the top. Inequality was built into all social relations. The king ruled by divine right. Superiors demanded deference from their people who were inferior to them. And in families, men had authority over their dependent women and children. Women and children whose legal identities were below that of men. Women could not own property. They couldn't negotiate or control their wages. They could not write separate wills, or even in most cases, even divorce their husband. And husband had rights to their wives' labor and bodies, meaning that if need be, a husband could, have his wife work and the wages would go to him. Okay? Few men enjoyed the freedom derived from economic independence. Usually, land ownership and property qualifications for voting meant that only a few men could vote. Modern civil liberties, such as freedom of religion and speech, did not exist at this time. Workers who had defied employers and labor contracts suffered harsh criminal penalties, and yet each European country that colonized the New World claimed to be spreading freedom for themselves and for the Indians. Okay. Now, in this next section, we're going to be looking at the expansion of Europe. We need to be thinking about what was it that impelled European explorers to look west across the Atlantic. What was their motivation for expanding westward? Europeans had, quote-unquote, discovered the Americas only because they were interested in finding a sea route to India, China, and the islands of the East Indies. And these had long been the basis of lucrative land-based trade in silk, tea, spices, porcelain, and other luxury-type goods. In the early 15th century, a large Chinese naval expedition intended to show China's power went all the way to East Africa and could not have gone further west, or could have gone farther west to the Americas, but the Chinese were uninterested in establishing a maritime empire. The Portuguese, benefiting from new techniques in sailing and navigation, first explored the Atlantic, making their way down the western coast of Africa, encountering powerful African kingdoms there, and also establishing small colonies on the islands of the Atlantic off of the African coast. The first sugar plantations based on slavery in the Atlantic world were on these islands. Portuguese explorers by 1498 had explored the Indian coast, and soon the Portuguese had established a maritime empire with trading outposts throughout Africa, India, southern China, and Indonesia. Although slavery existed in Africa before the Europeans came, Africans enslaved other Africans who were criminals, people who owed debt, or who had become captives during war. They worked in households, and families had some rights and could become free. African slavery was one of several forms of labor and was not the basis of African economies. With the Portuguese and other Europeans in Africa by the end of the 15th century, slavery then becomes purely economic, and a large slave trade within and beyond Africa developed. You can see on this map, this is 15th century, the world known to Europeans was limited to Europe, parts of Africa and Asia. Explorers from Portugal sought to find the sea route to the east in order to circumvent the Italian city-states and Middle Eastern rulers who had controlled the overland trade. So we're talking about those rulers that are in the Ottoman Empire, Persia, between Europe and where their ultimate goal of India and China, the east of these was. We see here in this picture, this is a detail from a Cantino world map depicting the western coast of Africa at the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. This was created by an anonymous Portuguese mapmaker in 1502. The map included Europe, Africa, and a small part of the Western Hemisphere, and described the islands lately discovered in the parts of India. It was smuggled out of Portugal by Alberto Cantino, and he was a diplomat who represented the Italian city-states. All right, next section. And you'll notice I kind of skipped over a little bit about the voyages of Columbus, because we'll be talking about that more here in this next section, talking about what really happened when the peoples of the Americas came in contact with Europeans. So we'll talk some more about Columbus here when we look at this. His voyages, remember that Columbus had sought financial support throughout Europe. Eventually, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain were his sponsors, in 1492, when he famously sailed his 3 ships to the Americas. And now we're going to look at what happened when Columbus comes in contact and when more Europeans come in contact with the native people in the Americas. Going back to his voyage in 1492, he'd been at sea for about 33 days. On October 12, 1492, he arrived at what we know today as the Bahamas. He soon went to Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and on to Cuba. After that first journey, he brought back 10 natives whom he called Indians to Spain for conversion to Christianity. The next year, Columbus returned with more ships and men, and this is the beginnings of Spanish colonization of the New World. There were a host of explorers and fishermen from European nations, including England, France, Portugal, that soon came to the Americas. But the Spanish conquistadors like Hernan Cortez, Francisco Pizarro, took the lead in conquering the Americas and the people living there, including these large native civilizations in South America, really just for national glory, for wealth, to spread Catholicism, and in doing so they devastated these cultures through warfare and disease, and laid the basis for gold and silver mines that would later enrich the Spanish crown. The transatlantic flow of goods and people mixed millions of years of separate evolution, put together plants, animals, and cultures. We call this the Columbian Exchange, and it transformed both Europe and the Americas. However, the impact of war, enslavement, and especially diseases that were introduced by Europeans was a demographic disaster for native peoples of the New World. Population fell dramatically, and in the 150 years since European contact, perhaps 80 million Indians, which would be nearly 1/5 of humankind at the time, so that's about 20% of the human population of the world, died as a result of exposure to diseases, war, and enslavement as a result of exploration. If you see on this picture, this is Columbus's landfall, an engraving from the Letter of the Islands. This is in 1493 pamphlet that was reproduced in the form of a poem. Columbus' first letter described his voyage of the previous year under the watchful eye of King Ferdinand of Spain, and Columbus and his men land on the Caribbean island where local Indians are fleeing. Here we see a map. These are voyages of discovery. Shows Columbus's first Atlantic crossing in 1492, being followed very soon after by voyages of discovery by English, Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian explorers. And you can see the different colors and, where they're starting out in Europe and the major areas to which explorers went in the Americas. On this next slide, we see engravings from the Florentine Codex of the forces of Cortez marching on Tenochtitlan and assaulting the city with cannon fire. The difference in military technology between the Spanish and the Aztecs is very evident, as you can see in this picture. Indians who allied with Cortez had helped him build vessels and carry them in pieces over the mountains to the city. The Codex, which is a volume formed by stitching together manuscript pages, was prepared under the supervision of a Spanish missionary in the 16th century Mexico. This is another image from the Florentine Codex that shows an Indian suffering from smallpox. And this was an epidemic, one of the many diseases, one of the most common diseases that ravaged the Aztec capital after the arrival of Cortez. Now in this next section we're going to be focusing on the Spanish Empire specifically, looking at what are the chief features of the Spanish Empire in America. By the mid-1500s, the Spanish had established an enormous global colonial empire that spanned from Europe to the Americas and Asia. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were now highways, moving people and goods, including gold and silver, shipped from Mexico and Peru to Spain and onto the Philippines and China. The Spanish Empire encompassed the most populous and mineral-rich areas of the New World and included large cities such as Mexico City. The Spanish system of colonial government was an elaborate hierarchy of appointed lawyers and bureaucrats under the authority of the Spanish monarchy. They had a significant role for the Catholic Church, especially in administering the Indians, and elected assemblies were non-existent. The Spanish did not import African slaves in large numbers because they relied on the dwindling but still fairly substantial Indian population to do the hard agricultural and mining labor for them. Although Spaniards born in Spain ruled the colonies, they, unlike English colonists, granted Indians some limited rights. And really, their goal was to assimilate the natives into Spanish society. The Spanish Empire also became increasingly dominated by mestizos, which are people of mixed native and European origin. This is an illustration from the Codex of 1531. I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that correctly, guys. Provided products and services such as taxes to Spanish conquerors. The banner of the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus reflects the early spread of Christianity. The people near Mexico City had aided Hernan Cortez in his conquest of the Aztec Empire. This codex was part of a successful lawsuit which endorsed by Cortez, in which Indians challenged excessive taxation by colonial officials. Here in this picture of 4 racial groups was taken from a series of paintings by an 18th century Mexican artist. It illustrates the racial mixing that took place in the Spanish Empire and some of the new vocabulary invented to describe it. The top left, called Offspring of a Spaniard and Indian, is a mestizo. On the top right, a Spaniard and a mestiza produce a castizo. The bottom left, the child of an Indian and a mestiza, is a coyote. And in the bottom right, the child of an Indian and an African woman is a chino. Most Europeans believed in the inherent superiority of their cultures and societies over those of the Indians. They did not question their right to conquer them. Before colonizing the New World, Europeans had fought each other in religious wars and conflicts and established a precedent for conquering other peoples and cultures based on religious and cultural notions of superiority and inferiority. The Spanish particularly embraced this mission to convert natives to Christianity, with the Protestant Reformation dividing the Catholic Church beginning in 1517. The Spanish believed that they had to convert natives to Catholicism to save them from heathenism and from Protestantism, part of their hope to assimilate the Indians and raise them to European levels of civilization. However, Spanish colonizers also saw Indians as workforce to use to extract gold, silver, and to enrich Spain. And in the process, worked many of the Indians to death. The Spanish believed they were giving Indians freedom through Christian conversion, while they also exploited them to make Spaniards and the Spanish crown immensely rich. This is a benign view of Spanish colonization. It's an engraving from 1621 book that depicts Spanish missionaries bringing Christianity to a new world, while priests do construction work. This is a fortified colonial town, is also visible in the background. In response to the Indians' conditions, Pope Paul III, hoping to make them more devout subjects of the European Catholic monarchs, outlawed Indian enslavement. And in 1542, Spain's new laws officially outlawed Indian slavery. The Dominican priest Bartolome de las Casas criticized his fellow Spaniards for their shocking atrocities and cruelties against native peoples, opposed their enslavement, and insisted that Indians were rational beings and not savages, and they could not be denied their freedom and land. Even though he suggested that the importation of African slaves might protect Indians from exploitation. Las Casas' criticism helped spread through Europe the black legend of Spain as exceptionally brutal and exploitative colonial empire. Las Casas and other Spaniards believed that colonists' cruel treatment of the natives undermined their empire's mission to convert and assimilate them. But some Spanish colonists resisted imperial reforms, including those that outlawed Indian slavery, by rebelling against the crown. In 1550, the Spanish abolished the encomienda system, in which Spanish colonists had the right to rule over conquered Indian lands and force Indians to work, and replaced it with the repartimiento system, in which Indians were legally free and entitled to wages, but still required to annually perform a fixed amount of labor. No longer slaves, Indians were still exploited by landlords and priests. In this drawing, Spanish conquistadors murdering Indians at Cusco is now known in what is now known as Peru. The Dutch-born engraver, Theodore de Bry, and his sons illustrated 10 volumes about New World exploration that were published between 1590 and 1618. A Protestant, de Bry created very vivid images that helped to spread this idea of the black legend of Spain as uniquely cruel colonizer. This is a 1791 view of the mission of San Carlos, which is now California. Shows the Indian community and a corral in the background, while missionaries and Spanish explorers greet one another in the foreground. Spanish explorers that were seeking new kingdoms of gold first came to the areas that would become the United States in the early 16th century, exploring the Pacific and Gulf coasts and parts of the Americas southeast and southwest. These expeditions spread disease and devastation among Indian communities in North America. Hernando de Soto's journey through the Gulf Coast and Southwest was especially brutal. Raping, torturing, and enslaving native peoples they encountered, De Soto's men also spread fatal diseases, all of which led to the virtual disappearance of once vibrant native communities. You can see here in this first table, this is the estimated regional population of Native Americans, about 1,500. You see, this is regional populations of the world. Same years. On this map shows the Spanish conquests and explorations in the New World from 1500 to 1600. By around 1600, New Spain had become a vast empire stretching from the modern-day American Southwest through Mexico and Central America and in the former Inca Kingdom of South America. The map shows the early Spanish exploration in present-day United States. You'll notice the highlighted green and pink areas show the extent of the Incan and Aztec peoples. The first area to be colonized by the Spanish in what became today's United States was Florida, where the Spanish had wiped out French settlers in their hopes of preventing further French colonization and ending piracy in nearby waters. Despite considerable Spanish efforts to build towns and forts and convert Indians, the Spanish presence in Florida remained very small. In the Southwest in 1598, the first major Spanish expedition in the area, led by Juan de Onate, searched for fabled minerals, but when attacked by the natives of Acoma in present-day New Mexico, they retaliated by killing and enslaving thousands of native inhabitants. Onate was recalled by Spanish authorities, and a period of more stable colonial rule was initiated with the establishment of New Mexico, its capital Santa Fe. By 1680, there were a small number of mostly mestizo Spanish colonists ruling over Pueblo Indians of New Mexico. Tensions arose over the colonists' exploitation of Indians' labor and their increasingly harsh efforts to convert Indians and eliminate indigenous religious practices and beliefs. Among other factors, this led to a revolt that year to drive Spanish from New Mexico and restore native autonomy and allow the natives to rule themselves. Led by Pope, a religious leader who had earlier been arrested by the Spanish for sorcery, the Pueblos attacked and nearly wiped out an entire population of Spanish colonists, destroying in the process all the symbols and icons of Spanish culture and Catholicism that they could find. 12 years later, the Spanish reconquered New Mexico for good. And this is a picture of Acoma, the Sky City, as it appeared in 1904. And this is St. Anthony and the Infant Jesus, which is painted on a tanned buffalo hide by a Franciscan priest in New Mexico in the early 18th century. This was not long after the Spanish had reconquered the area from which they had been driven out during the Pueblo Revolt. In this next section, we're going to be focusing on the French and Dutch empires. We want to look at the chief features of what the French and Dutch empires of North America looks like. And be thinking about maybe how these are a little bit different than that of the Spanish. Even as other European powers really had disdain or looked down upon the way that the Spanish had treated the Indians, they wanted to match the wealth that the Spanish had accumulated. So they didn't really, looked down upon the way that the Spanish treated the Native Americans, yet at the same time they wanted to be just as wealthy. So during the 17th century, rival French, Dutch, and English colonists established colonies in North America. The French were first, hoping to find gold and locate the Northwest Passage to the Pacific. Failed initial settlements were followed by permanent settlements in the Mississippi River Valley and along the St. Lawrence River in what became Canada. Then was what was called New France. The French crown limited migration, however, keeping French colonist numbers small. Few in number and embracing the fur trade rather than agriculture, French colonists depended on friendly relations with local Indians. The French were not as interested in land as the English or in exploiting Indian labor as the Spanish. The French had created an elaborate military, commercial, and diplomatic connections with the natives. They created alliances with the Indians and really that were not seen anywhere else in North America as far as how good these alliances were and how durable they were. Although the French Jesuits sought to convert the Indians, the French generally were more tolerant of the Indian religions and their spiritual practices than other European colonists would be. And in kind of the middle ground of the upper Great Lakes region, the French and the Indians mixed in relative equality. They lived kind of equal to one another. However, French colonialism brought the same disease and warfare to native populations, especially as the fur trade and the introduction of European commodities intensified conflicts that had already existed between native groups, and as wars between European colonists in the continent embroiled natives allied to different European powers. As you can see in this Native American present-day Nova Scotia, this was carved by a Native American who would live in present-day Nova Scotia. Long before explorers and colonists descended in the area, residents were familiar with Europeans. One chief had acquired a French ship and traded with fishermen out to sea. Here we see a map of the New World, New France, New Netherlands, French settlements and French colonies around 1650. And here is a picture of France bringing faith to the Indians of New France. This is your visions of freedom. If you were to look at this, think about the ways that the painting suggests Indians freely accepting Catholicism and French rule, and thinking about the images of the house, the ship, and the dress of the Indians, and how that might reinforce the message of the painting. This engraving, which was in Samuel de Champlain's 1613 account of his voyages, is really the only likeness of the explorer of his time. We see Champlain wearing European armor and brandishing an advanced weapon, standing at the center of this battle between his Indian allies and the hostile Iroquois. Now we're going to take a look at the Dutch. The Dutch first came to the New World with Henry Hudson's exploration of New York Harbor and of the river that would come to bear his name in 1609, the Hudson River. Set the stage for the establishment in 1624 of New Amsterdam, the Dutch outpost on Manhattan, which became the basis for New York. Although very small in size and population, the Netherlands was the center of a global maritime empire of trade, culture, and enlightenment, and the Dutch invented practices like joint stock companies that were critical and very important to the birth of modern capitalism. You'll see this is a picture of New Amsterdam, 1651. Though the Netherlands was exceptional at its commitment to freedom of the press and religious toleration, New Netherland was hardly governed democratically. New Amsterdam was ruled by the West India Company, did not have an elected assembly or a town council common in the Netherlands at the time. Dutch slaves did have some rights, women enjoyed more freedoms than elsewhere in the continent, and religious toleration was exceptionally broad, which led to the most religious and ethnic diversity in the North American colonies. New Netherland attracted a diverse array of settlers from different areas of the world. And of course, that included the practice of a variety of religions. The Dutch were more tolerant of other religions than other colonial communities in other areas of America. But it's important to note that the official religion both of Holland and New Netherland was the Dutch Reformed Church. Thus, while being more tolerant of religious diversity, New Netherland was not devoid of conflict over religion. Restrictions on openly practicing other religions besides that of the Dutch Reformed Church were denied by government officials. In some instances, those who protested the restrictions were arrested for defiance. The West India Company gradually loosened its control over New Netherland and offered incentives for settlement, including large estates for patrons, which are shareholders who agreed to transport tenants for agricultural labor. Several patrons established large estates where they ruled autocratically over their tenants, leading to rebellions in the 18th century as freehold tenure became common. Despite the best efforts of its rulers to attract settlers, however, New Netherland remained tiny outposts in a global Dutch empire. The Protestant Dutch, interested in trade rather than conquest and having recently liberated themselves from Spanish rule over the Netherlands, generally identified with the Indians as fellow victims of Spanish and Catholic oppression. They recognized Indian sovereignty over the land, forbid Dutch settlement until legal title to the land had been purchased from the Indians, but the Dutch required tribes to pay them, and Dutch settlers oftentimes provoked conflict with local Indians. This is the seal of New Netherland, which was adopted by the Dutch West India Company in 1630. It suggests the centrality of the fur trade to the colony's prospects. Surrounding the beaver, in the middle, is wampum, a string of beads that were used by Indians in religious rituals and as currency. And this is a map of the Western Hemisphere published in Antwerp in 1592, which was then ruled by Spain and now part of Belgium. Shows North America divided between New France and New Spain. This is before the coming of the English.